This is Kit Cabell, co-founder of Veracity In Defiance, and we are here on location with Thomas Frank. Where are we at exactly?
All right, so we're right on the edge of the Chicago-Gary Airport, just on the just east of East Chicago's tank farm, the Citgo oil tank farm. Mm-hmm. And right here, while they were expanding the Gary Airport, they broke through a bunch of pipelines that they thought that they didn't know that existed, and they couldn't identify who owned them. At the time, it was about 3-4 years ago, they estimated it was about 1 million gallons that was spilled and that was sitting in those pipes. I can't understand why they wouldn't know who owned 1 million gallons of oil. So what they've done is they've just allowed it to accumulate in this ditch, and they've ran a PVC pipe to kind of collect it as it spills. I don't think there's been much more of an effort than that, than to put booms in and do some collecting as it spills, not really to stop the spill and to seal it or to go after it.
How long has this been going on?
This is about 4 or 5 years. It's a pretty massive oil spill with no emergency alert or emergency actions in place to address it.
I can smell it from over here. This is just absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, it's disgusting, and it does smell very, very strongly. As you can see, these are sniffers and markers for pipelines. You got BP's pipeline and another oil pipeline designated right here on site.
What has been BP's response to this disaster, and what has been the Indiana state's government's response to this disaster?
Well, like I said, I don't think anybody's taken responsibility, and they haven't identified the responsible party here. So there's nobody to go back to. That's something that seems to happen quite a bit. You know, whenever there is a city project or something and digging in the streets to replace a sewer, sometimes or quite often we find another moment where, oh my God, there was a spill here, and we can't figure out who's responsible for it. So the residents of East Chicago somehow have to pick up that tab to do the cleanup.
This is absolutely foul smelling. This is disgusting, and it's really taken a lot out of me just not to throw up here. But you know, when I look at something like this, I got to ask them this question. Who then, are there any environmental groups that are petitioning to combat this? Because this can't stay here like this forever. There's got to be somebody fighting for this.
Right. So we had some really strong environmental justice movements in the 90s and up until 2000s, but most of those have ran into problems with funding. So in the last 15 years, we really have had very little or no support in terms of the environmental community, especially the big NGOs, the Sierra Club and the NRDC really have not been focused on these things, and we don't have a local group any longer. The only environmental attorney that we have is 2 counties away. The ABA, the American Bar Association, maintains data on their membership. They have identified that they have 30,000 environmental attorneys that are employed full-time.
Okay.
Of that, 28,000 of them are employed by corporations and industry. Less than 2,000 are employed by government agencies, and less than 600 are employed by nonprofits. We have to have a start. We have to actually start protecting our environment. We're on the southern shores of Lake Michigan, where we carried a lot of heavy industry for a long, long time, and we have yet to address it. We haven't done much of a cleanup. And the problems that we have in Northwest Indiana and also in many places of the state is that those who are responsible have been allowed to escape. And they've been coming back, EPA has been kind of coming back and trying to do some remediation and capping. But it's kind of like if you go into a store and you break something, chances are you're going to be charged 100% for what you broke. Industries are not being charged for what they broke in the environment, and there's tens of billions of dollars of damage. And that's a really difficult burden for a low-income community of color to overcome. If we would address the issues that we find in fence-line communities, if we wouldn't allow industries to do what they do here, we wouldn't have the aggregate problem of climate change. But because we allow these things to happen in places that they devalue and don't care for, these hidden places, what I call black holes, we do have that aggregate problem because we allow this to happen in so many places around the world, and that's a real problem.
This is a disaster. No one's stepping up, and this requires action. It requires people to do the right thing. You know, this is our country, and if we as citizens want to live in a stable environment and want to give something to the next generation, it's up to us to stand up and say enough is enough, because we cannot give this to the next generation. This is just merely scratching the surface.
We're sitting on the property of what's called Traby right now, or in front of their property. Traby is a energy, or waste to energy, or industrial waste to energy facility. This used to be a neighborhood in East Chicago. This was the neighborhood called the Brickyard, and so they moved in right next to the neighborhood of Brickyard. And by 1994, a cluster of cancers and a lot of illnesses developed very, very quickly and aggressively. So instead of trying to address the environmentals of the company or the industry that moved in here, they decided to tear down the Brickyard in 1995. And so this is another example of how industry has encroached on our neighborhoods and cannibalized on the community. Once again, today, at the time it was called Pollution Control Industries. Now it's called Traby. This was a facility that caused an uproar throughout the country. They were going to be shipping on tankers Agent Orange here to be processed, to be converted to energy. So all around the trains and the lines and the route, people came out and protested because they didn't want Agent Orange going through their community. To this day, all sorts of nasty, no good things come into this facility to be converted to industrial energy. It affects even where I live, and it affects much of what we have a couple of stable middle-class neighborhoods here, and it's affecting them.
Yeah, how you doing, sir?
Oh, we're just introducing what this facility is.
Do any of you work here?
No.
Do you have permission to do so?
No.
Be gone.
So what you're seeing across the street is Central Park in East Chicago. In the 1920s and through the 50s, this is what was designated as Central Park. That was when Union Carbide located here, and now it's called Praxair. Praxair manages industrial gases for the mills.
And how long have they been active here?
For over 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah.
All right. So, what's precisely that they're facilitating here, man?
Well, what they do is they produce a lot of ammonia and a lot of other industrial gases for the steel mills that you're going to be seeing down the road a little bit. And you got to remember, these are some of the largest industrial complexes on this planet. When they permit a place like this, they don't take into account, and they're not allowed to take into account the fact there's another polluter across the street, and another one, and another one, and another one. So they don't take into account the aggregate impacts on the community. And that's what we're seeing here. When this East Chicago was built, it was a master planned city. They had great buffers. Even in the late 19th century, they understood the impacts of industry. Okay. People think that they build homes next to industry. The fact is, industry has encroached. And what you're seeing here is, in the last 50 years, one of many industries that have encroached on our neighborhoods.
Again, you have more unregulated industry, more pollutants. How much longer do we as a nation have to suffer because of this vast amount of unregulated industry? You know, this is our country, and for years I've always been taught that we're supposed to ensure that the next generation has a secure environment, a safe environment to live in. How can we give that to them if we're polluting the air, water, and land that we live on? East Chicago is just a tipping point. And I'm grateful for our good friend here, Thomas Frank, to give us a tour of some of these very toxic areas that are located here.
I mean, what we're seeing here is, having an oil tank farm right there where there are potential disasters in the waiting and perhaps have occurred in the past. We don't know about, if we haven't tested the water table here, we don't know what impacts that has had on the adjacent properties here. Low-income communities are hugely impacted by these problems. It's a normal thing for them. In this area, on the southern shores of Lake Michigan and on the Indiana Harbor shipping canal, this was considered the greatest area of concern.
I think we're just scratching the surface, and if we could dig any deeper, we're going to see more issues, more concerns, and this might not only be just a statewide issue for the state of Indiana, but maybe an interstate issue affecting Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan.
It most possibly could, especially in the Rust Belt communities. But behind us here is the largest tar sands refinery in the country, and this is BP. This was not here 7 years ago. They moved the refinery down here into East Chicago and right across the street from Marktown, and they completed that project 2 years ago in February, and in March they started sending out notices to the residents of Marktown that they intended to tear down all of Marktown. The city of East Chicago, which is one of the poorest cities in the country, or in the state especially, awarded BP $165 million to do that. 2 years ago in March, they spilled tar sands into Lake Michigan, which is ironically about a month after that, the Coast Guard fined them for that, and you would expect it to be a major fine, but they fined them for $2,000.